Tell me if you've been here before. You've just picked up a new shonen anime, and it's got probably one of the most interesting power systems you've ever seen in fiction. Or maybe it's a power system similar to something you've enjoyed in the past, except that this power system doesn't have all the holes and flaws of a previous power system. Then, as the story goes on, you inexplicably develop a hatred for the power system of the story and its inconsistency. I would say that this is a very common experience when it comes to watching long-running shonen. Eventually, the story goes on for long enough that the writers break their power ceilings in an effort to raise the stakes for the next big bad villain. And the fandoms are no better. Power scaling is its own niche genre on YouTube, and it can be quite fun to theorize and argue about which fictional character can beat another fictional character in a fight. We've all got these ideas of planet busters and rankings, from base forms to super ascended god, ultimate god, lesbian god, Saiyan god, titan form 3s. Power scaling is important, and it's often poorly written. The first reason you suck at power scaling is often not a matter of the power system itself, but rather the lack of limitations and rules you have set for them. Don't get me wrong, a good open-ended power system can be super fun to engage with, but oftentimes if the writer does not rein themselves in, they follow the power system to its logical conclusion: godhood. Most series without hard power ceilings and limitations will often have their characters ascend to some sort of godlike, untouchable state. Sometimes they do this numerous times in the story. The most prevalent of these offenders is Dragon Ball, as I'm sure many of you have already been thinking. And that's where all of this really starts, isn't it? Back in the day, when Dragon Ball first came out and contested characters like Superman, everyone had been debating who would win in that fight. The feats shown by characters like Goku will always capture the imagination and make us wonder about how he stacks up in comparison to other super powerful characters like Superman. The conversation is especially interesting when the characters of other shows and series have powers which lie outside the realm of simply punching someone really fucking hard. Can Goku beat Danny Phantom if Danny Phantom goes intangible? I don't know. Either way, I'm not here to talk about which characters will beat whichever other characters across fiction. The answer is that my personal OCs will always beat everybody in every fiction, because I'm the writer and because I say so. In all seriousness though, I'm here to tell you as a writer not to worry about those things. I'm also here to perhaps provide some solutions on how to do power scaling right in your story. But in order to understand what to do right, we must first understand what is often done wrong. And in the case of a show like Dragon Ball, not only does it lack a power ceiling, but the power scaling is often inconsistent. Inconsistency within your power system is yet another fatal flaw in power scaling. One moment, Goku is injured by a bullet, and in the next moment, he's getting punched by a god who could kill the entire universe with a single punch, if the power scaling community around Dragon Ball is to be believed. In one moment, Goku is a Super Saiyan god, with power far beyond that of his most powerful form, from which he could already destroy entire solar systems based on his feats alone. Only for an older character like Android 17 to have a equal match with the form which is ascended past that god form. If power scaling was consistent in the DBZ universe, hardly any of the other characters in the show would be alive, let alone helpful in a fight. In fact, it's very apparent that after the Frieza arc, Toriyama struggled to involve the other characters in the story beyond being commentators who act shocked at how powerful our main characters are. But let's switch over to a shonen that's inspired by Dragon Ball, as many tend to be: Naruto. Naruto had humble beginnings with its power system. Humble beginnings which seem very out of place now that I've gone and rewatched the show, and that we have the full context of the power system in mind. Where at one point we could have believed that the ninja of Naruto were stealthy, calculating spies and assassins, by the end of the series, it's any wonder why the ninja attempted to sneak around in the first place. Just punch the city and destroy everything. It's that easy. Stack this onto the fact that the majority of the most powerful and gifted ninja in the world turn out to be a bunch of teenagers, and this power system kind of starts to lose its appeal. I mean, if fully grown adults cannot contend with children despite having more time and resources to increase their might, then why does any of it really matter? What is the point of a Jonin if a Genin is currently capable of leveling an entire country by themselves? What is the point of espionage when some ninja have perception powers that flatly ignore any attempts at stealth? Why are we still calling them ninja if all of them are meeting one another in an open battlefield in broad daylight? Why don't more people wear armor or use more practical weapons of warfare? At the end of the day, Naruto goes from a story about ninjas and child soldiers to a story about kung fu wizards fighting with their inner demons, who are also very real inner demons. The power scaling got out of control, and thus the original tone and theming of the story was completely lost. In fact, we are left to wonder why any of the original tactics were being used if certain characters and abilities already existed in the world long before the first episode. Another reason you suck at power scaling is simply because you do not introduce the concept of tactics into your fiction. Time and time again, I've seen this in both power scaling communities and the shows that they enjoy. A lot of the time, people assume that because one character is stronger and faster than another, that means they can beat that other character in a fight. But being a sprinter does not make you a better fighter, nor does being a powerlifter make you a better fighter. Those things can maybe contribute to that, but if you don't know how to fight, then you don't know how to fight. And if all of your characters are simply just trying to get stronger and punch each other harder, then unfortunately this is not only a boring way to structure the fights and power scaling of your world, it's also just not how real fights work. Styles make fights, and your tactics are far more important than your overall physicality during a fight. Yes, someone might be born with a God-given gift to knock people out with the force of a semi-truck in their knuckles, but none of that means anything if they cannot connect their haymaker, or if they leave themselves open to being countered and knocked out themselves. When it comes to power scaling, just because one character was able to beat another character should not mean that the one character could beat everyone their opponent could beat. To think of this in less convoluted terms, think about Pokemon. Each Pokemon type has its own strength and weakness, and even stats. Sometimes a Pokemon can have an incredibly good type combination, but lack the stats or overall move pools to make that typing work. Meanwhile, other Pokemon can have wonderful stats, but their ability completely kneecaps them. Your tactics matter in Pokemon too. You want to be able to read your opponent's next move and ensure you pick the right Pokemon for the right turn. Fighting and power systems should be structured in this way as well. I advise that if you want to write a story with good power scaling, then you should figure out ways to diversify the utilities of your power system and the styles with which characters fight. Ask yourself questions about how a character chooses to fight in any given situation. Also ask yourself about who they have an advantage over versus who they do not. Some characters in your stories should be able to defeat foes who are far greater than they are, not because they've unlocked some new secret power level boost, but because their fighting style and their abilities directly counter their opponent and give them a series of unique advantages which help them to win. This is one thing I think a show like Jujutsu Kaisen actually gets right. Gege Akutami often avoids scaling his characters to ludicrous heights like other shonen tend to do, and instead opts to think of which characters' abilities are good counters to the enemies that they face, unless you're Gojo or Sukuna. Alone, someone like Yuji may not be able to bring down a special grade curse in the first couple of seasons, but with the help of a first grade like Todo, and a bit more understanding of Jujutsu sorcery, he most definitely can. Somewhat related to and better written than Jujutsu Kaisen is Hunter x Hunter, which introduces one of the most critically acclaimed power systems in fiction. And even though Hunter x Hunter has been ongoing for about as long, if not longer, than I have been alive, they still have yet to break their power system. Or finish the story, for that matter. But Hunter x Hunter still serves as a great example to structure a power system around. We have people who are clearly on another level from everyone else, capable of pulling off feats which rank among the most dangerous beings in the world. And then we have people who are not quite so powerful. The Hunter exam arc serves to show us the bare minimum for being considered worth anything in the series, and it's really not meant to be a test which determines strength. strength. Hunter x Hunter shows us the ceiling for their power levels very early on, and often refuses to allow main protagonists to discover some sort of plot armor infused power-up to defeat foes they have no chance of defeating. Instead, the writer focuses on the social and interpersonal reasons for why characters like Gon and Killua are spared whenever they find themselves far out of their depths. The series also acknowledges that both Gon and Killua are talents which can only be seen once every 1,000 years. Despite being the youngest characters in their series, they are capable of being about B tier on the power scale with a potential to reach double S tier in the future. The fact that they are still children is a detriment, but it is their talent which allows them to stand toe-to-toe with dangerous enemies who can use Nen. And because of the way Hunter x Hunter is structured, we, the audience, can easily see where the power system might scale later on, especially during the final episodes of the Chimera Ants arc, where we see Gon pay the ultimate price to momentarily realize that true potential at the cost of everything else. At least until Killua's sister is conveniently dropped into the story to wish him back to life, but I'm sure that's not going to do anything bad to the power system now that Pandora's box has been opened. Another reason you might suck at writing good power scaling, by the way, is just that. Pandora's box. Once you've opened up an avenue of power, you cannot close it again, or at the very least, it's very difficult to close that box. During the third movie of the Star Wars sequel trilogy, I believe many people were introduced to this concept. Oftentimes, people wondered why, in a world where every spaceship can go warp speed on a dime, that no one decided to use the literal hundreds of millions of tons of metal moving at the speed of light as a projectile to cause mass destruction. Many in the Star Wars community theorized that it was hypothetically possible, but that either for plot reasons or some unintroduced lore, ships simply never kamikazed into other much larger ships at light speed. Sometimes power scaling requires that we ignore and steer around the large hole in logic so that we can enjoy the simplicity and vibes of what we've already created. That was until The Rise of Skywalker decided to throw all of that away for an admittedly cool moment. Because yes, no one else in the history of the galaxy was either smart enough or desperate enough to try ramming their ship at light speed into an entire armada of much bigger and much more expensive ships. In fact, I would say this scene alone could be used to change the world of Star Wars altogether. After all, if any ship that is capable of light speed, which happens to be all of them in the Star Wars universe, can do this, then who is to say that certain rebels or terrorist groups would not attempt to turn all of their ships into light speed kinetic bombs to reduce all those super expensive and massive targets, I mean Star Destroyers, to rubble? War would change in Star Wars, and pretty soon the story would be less about having two massive space armadas meeting in the middle of a solar system to fire lasers at each other, and more about spacecraft who are capable of maneuvering out of the way of other smaller spacecraft which are attempting to ram them at light speed. It would be a change for Star Wars that I don't think would be all that engaging, and it might ruin the vibe of the story. But at the same time, now that Pandora's box is opened, I'm left to question why there's not more random maniacs who are doing this. What we all initially suspended our disbelief for as the audience has been put in front of us and canonized to the point that we no longer simply admit to ourselves that it has just not been done simply because it would ruin any future space battles, which is what we're all here to see. And opening Pandora's box can take many forms. Super Saiyan 2 was a Pandora's box of its own, one which should not have been opened or introduced at all, and which Toriyama forgot he opened in the first place until he opened a second Pandora's box in the creation of Super Saiyan 3. Yes, sometimes as a writer, it is important to recognize what is a Pandora's box in your own power system, so that you can bury it as far below the Earth's crust as humanly possible so that it never opens. A Pandora's box has a few distinguishing features. It is a question posed about your world and your power system, which in the act of answering forever changes the power system. A Pandora's box is also distinguished by the permanency of its introduction. No amount of retconning or backtracking will ever make it go away. Finally, Pandora's boxes often exist in power systems which are uniquely meant to be simple while ignoring key details that would otherwise change the entire tone and plot of the story. Imagine if the Pokemon anime ever introduced the concept that Pokemon can be killed during battles. It would fundamentally change the tone and meaning behind Pokemon as a series, but that's already been done in the Pokemon Adventures manga. And it's actually worked to great effect. And I think this brings me to my next point. Even though they opened the Pandora's box in showing something like an Arbok acid melting the skin off another Pokemon like Psyduck, Pokemon Adventures instead followed the logic to its conclusion and made a far more interesting story out of it. This is my next reason why you suck at power scaling. And that's because you're too attached to the original concepts of your power system to properly mold it into something that's more interesting. Killing your darlings is a phrase in writing for a reason, and sometimes acknowledging and opening a Pandora's box is actually a good thing, but only if you are capable enough as a writer to allow it to fundamentally change your story for the better. Sure, we could ignore these small little holes in our power system and leave them unanswered, but we could also address them. And in addressing them, we might find that we end up fleshing out our power systems in the process of explaining away things that we previously tried to ignore. Power scaling is also something which I have often grappled with in my own writing. Oftentimes, in an effort to write a cool or engaging fight, I can get lost in the flair and spectacle of it, before realizing that I've accidentally made my characters far too powerful too quickly, because the issue with making a character too powerful too quickly is that you inevitably end up doing one of two things. You find a way to nerf the characters, or you find a way to make the opposition stronger. The first option is often the worst of the two, but not always. Depending on how you write it, the nerf can make a ton of sense, or it can completely ruin the immersion of the story. On the other hand, the second option is often the selling point to most long-running shonen. We see our protagonists reach new heights of power, and therefore they achieve a new scale for which they must now measure up against, in opposition to more powerful dark forces. But I want to go back to some advice on that first option that I said. What is a good way to nerf a character you've already made too powerful in your story? The first thing someone might try to do is question why the character is so powerful in the first place. If this character's power comes from something external, such as a mystical artifact or a gift from a divine being, then we can just as easily take that power away from them, can't we? Either the artifact is damaged and must be repaired through a long journey of learning and growing, or it is stolen and used against them by the villainous characters. And if it is a divine blessing, then perhaps the blessing is weakened through external forces, or the character falls out of favor in some way to the higher power that granted them those abilities in the first place. If a character's power comes from something more internal, such as power gained through serious effort like it is in most shonen, it becomes rather difficult to nerf the character without breaking audience immersion. However, it's not impossible, because while a character can be empowered by the things within themselves, they can also be held back by it. This is an opportunity for you as a writer to move your focus away from things like big laser beams and planet-cracking punches towards deep character introspection and moments of doubt. A character cannot always perform at their best, even if they are highly competent in their stories. Sometimes a mental block can be the difference between winning and losing. Sometimes a character can attempt to self-destruct in an effort to pay some sort of penance for something they did in the past. A character can also undergo a life-changing injury wherein the height of their power is severely limited, and the story becomes about their journey to recovery. There are a myriad of ways a writer can go about nerfing their overpowered characters, none of which have anything to do with creating a random asshole to quickly tell the audience that this character is not as strong as they thought they were, and that they were always a loser with a god complex who had no chance of defeating Sukuna. Anyways, this also brings me to my next point about how to properly scale opposition when you've made characters too powerful in your story. The issue with a lot of long-running shonen anime is that they often tend to jump the shark at some points, and if they run for long enough, they will eventually jump numerous sharks, including a genetically modified space shark with laser cannons and a chainsaw mouth. In other words, there comes a point when power scaling your opposition becomes utterly absurd. If there are beings who are capable of destroying planets in your world, we must also have a good reason for why those beings have not showed up before in the story, or why they have not just destroyed the planet our protagonists live in. I also think that many writers tend to get the wrong idea when it comes to challenging their characters. Whenever their protagonists get stronger, they think that the antagonists must also get stronger in proportion. However, a good writer will recognize that there are two types of power scaling. There is vertical power scaling, wherein the same things are done but in greater amounts with less effort, and there is horizontal power scaling, where new powers are introduced which are not directly comparable to previous powers, and therefore can provide new and unique challenges to our protagonists. Horizontal and vertical power scaling deserves its own standalone video, but I think it's worth mentioning here that neither is better than the other, but both are necessary tools to utilize in moderation. If you have too much of one, then it's time to use the other, basically. If you've got too many unique powers in your story, you can end up with an incredibly convoluted magic system, which must be over-explained by the narrator at every fucking turn. Okay, I promise I'll stop subtweeting JJK, but, you know, it's a good example of what I'm talking about. I know before in this video I said they did a good job, but they also did a bad job, and that's kind of just JJK as a whole. They did a good job in the beginning, and then they just didn't do a good job later. You see, if there's too much horizontal power scaling in your story where you've introduced a number of different and unique abilities, then it can quickly become confusing for the audience as well as a hassle to write about. I believe it's the same effect as introducing way too many characters. You never get to fully develop and help the audience understand those characters. Your powers should be their own types of characters in the story. When you've got too much horizontal power scaling, that's when it's time to build upon the pre-existing powers and evolve them into something which provides new meaning to the audience. Let's say that your character has ice powers, for example. They're always getting bodied by people with fire powers, melting their ice. This character might shoot off their ice bullets only to have them melted instantly by fire. Well, ice is basically just hard water, so why not allow this character to have water powers too? Why not allow them to expand their powers into things such as steam, fog, or large waves of water? What if they summon creatures who are made of ice and water? This is what I would like to call depth scaling, wherein we introduce a new power which is already related to the fundamental abilities of a character, but which cannot be fully considered either a horizontal or vertical power scale. It's the diagonal between the two. A character with ice powers realizing they can use water has now opened up a slew of new abilities while also making themselves a more powerful adversary. If it was a horizontal power scale, I would have given them wind or fire powers. And if it was a vertical power scale, I would have just said that they're able to cast more ice that's colder and harder and doesn't get melted by fire. But instead, it's building on what is already present and restructuring how we view that character's abilities. This character is still and always has been using water powers. They're just using all aspects of water now. Or if we wanted to go a different route, we could say that this character with ice powers is actually not controlling water, but controlling temperature. And when you control temperature, that means you can also make the temperature go up. In other words, this character with ice powers, who's controlling temperatures, is also capable of wielding fire themselves. That's something that ReZero has done. And while I'm not going to talk at any length about ReZero and their power system, just know that their power system is a good example of good power scale. Depth scaling is the type of thing I like to do with most of my settings. I enjoy being able to connect a power to something which is already established, or have something which introduces a boost in power while also making complete sense in the narrative. Now, as I said, I can sometimes struggle with power scaling my characters, but that's the moment when you should take a step back as a writer and determine exactly how powerful you want your characters to be at any given moment in the story and why you want them to be that way. The reason you might suck at power scaling is not that your characters are too weak or too powerful, but that the power system has gotten out of your control as a writer. You've either opened a Pandora's box that you didn't want to open because you needed to write yourself out of a corner you wrote yourself into, or you have not kept track of what certain new powers say about your world. Either way, the story has gone to shit because all of the tension and immersion in a story is lost if we cannot buy into the power system at the center of it. So take the power into your own hands. Remember your goals when you first started writing your power system. Open up a document, or a spreadsheet if you really want to get into the weeds like I do, and start writing.